Good evening and welcome to the new Bugajski Hour from Washington, D.C. I would like to thank Voice of America for hosting the Washington episodes of my show for RTK. And today I will be discussing some important international questions with a major U.S. security analyst. Our guest on the Bugajski hot seat is Luke Coffey, director of the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy and the Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation in Washington. But first, my political commentary on a key international topic is titled Dangers of an Atlantic Rift. The EU's new defense agreement risks weakening NATO and alienating the United States from its Atlantic allies. If the so-called PESCO Pact among EU members leads to the diversion of resources and equipment from NATO, then some decision makers may conclude that candidate Donald Trump was correct in claiming that the North Atlantic Alliance has become obsolete. The UN launched its Permanent Structured Cooperation on Security Defense, or PESCO, at the close of 2017, a project driven primarily by Germany, France, Italy and Spain. US officials and generals are anxious that some PESCO initiatives may pull resources out of NATO. In his recent visit to NATO headquarters in Brussels, US Defense Secretary James Mattis told his European counterparts that the US is only supportive of PESCO if it complements NATO's activities. One useful PESCO initiative would be to lower legal requirements that slow the movement of military equipment between European states in case of a crisis. This has been a major focus for NATO since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014. However, the Pentagon is concerned that PESCO may compound the problem by creating two sets of rules, one for the EU and one for NATO. Above all, Mattis wants to focus Europe on modernization and burden sharing. Only 5 states fulfill the 2% of GDP requirements for military spending. Washington is also urging NATO members to meet an equally important guideline by allocating at least 20% of their defense spending for military equipment. Less than half of the alliance met this stipulation last year. Supporters of PESCO argued that the initiative will not conflict with NATO. If PESCO results in a limited mandate for a small international crisis response force that combats piracy, smuggling, rescues distressed ships, provides humanitarian assistance, and contributes to counter-terrorist operations, then this would be valuable. Another potentially positive outcome of PESCO would be to integrate the fractured EU defense industry. However, American officials have warned the EU not to impose protectionist measures around Europe's defense industry by excluding US companies from the bidding process for military equipment. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has asserted that EU efforts to boost its defense spending under the pact were welcome, but only if this was coordinated with NATO. He also warned that the EU could not replace the alliance in guaranteeing European security. Instead, the Union should pool its security within NATO, the most effective organization that maintains the US in Europe and maintains peace in Europe. It is time now for the Bugajski hot seat with our special guest, Luke Coffey. Luke is the director of the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center and of Foreign Policy and the Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy, quite a mouthful, at the Heritage Foundation in DC. Luke, thanks for joining me. It's good to have you on the show.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
I think actually you may be the first person recently from the Heritage Foundation that's on the show. So it's a good opportunity to tell our viewers about Heritage, its background, what it does, its role, its impact in Washington.
Great. Well, the Heritage Foundation is a non-for-profit, nonpartisan think tank. We've been around since the early 70s. And we focus on all policy areas: foreign policy, domestic policy, military, environment, education, healthcare, that sort of thing. And basically we try to come up with better ways for government to do things. We try to provide recommendations to Congress and to the executive branch on how we think they can do something better. That's really the crux of what we do at the Heritage Foundation.
And you're considered a conservative think tank?
Yes, we're politically conservative. That's a very important point to make, but we are nonpartisan. So we do not get involved in party political debates. So we don't endorse candidates. We don't back Republicans over Democrats or Democrats over Republicans. We support a set of conservative principles as they're largely considered to be on the traditional left-right political spectrum. So limited government spending, individual liberty and freedom, strong national defense, American leadership, these sort of things.
That is key, I think, on the conservative international side, strong national defense. I mean, I know Heritage has always been a strong supporter of NATO and of the alliance.
And we continue to do so.
Let's look now at this administration, however you define it, whether it's conservative or not. There's a lot of debate on this. But regardless of the domestic policy, what would you say have been the main foreign and security policy achievements of the Donald Trump administration?
Well, President Trump, I would say, is not ideologically driven as an individual. And I think in many cases he can operate in that political space where the left and the right sometimes can meet. This is generally called populism, but call it what you want. This is sort of the political space in which he operates. But on the foreign policy side of things, I think he's taken a more traditional Republican approach to many of America's challenges. And I will admit that someone who identifies as being politically conservative myself and someone who has made a career on transatlantic security issues, I, for one, was alarmed at some of the things I was hearing during the campaign. But when you look at what President Trump's administration is doing in practice, what they're actually doing on the ground, so get beyond the tweets, get beyond all the campaign rhetoric, and look at actionable outcomes, I think the United States is in a very good place when it comes to our relations with Europe and transatlantic security, and even with Russia. So this is an administration that has definitely departed from the Obama administration, I would say, on its dealings with Europe and with NATO, more so less on the rhetoric and more on practical outcomes. And you have other issues too, like with the Iran deal, taking a stronger position with Iran, decertifying the deal but not completely leaving the deal, I think was his best course of action when it comes to Iran, or staying committed to Afghanistan, not only staying committed to the mission in Afghanistan, but boosting this mission, the training, advising, and assistance mission that we have there. My concern on Afghanistan, my concern with President Trump was that he was going to either go home or go very big, and he stuck to that middle ground of training and advising, which I think is the most enduring policy for the U.S. to keep in the country.
What's interesting, you mentioned the populists at the beginning. I suppose you could define Trump as such, but definitely there was a wing of his advisors that did belong to that sort of nationalist populist wing, which isn't strictly speaking conservative. And I think you're right. I think they were in dismay in terms of the continuity of the Afghanistan policy, NATO policy, engagement with Europe and so forth. But that side, I would say, of his advisors has been discarded.
Yes, in fact, with the to continue on about Afghanistan, for me, the most important part of that announcement was not staying committed to the mission. It was the fact that Trump's national security advisor, General H.R. McMaster, stayed in his position and Steve Bannon left the White House.
Precisely.
Because that was the big, that was the friction point between the two camps. And that was an insurgency that H.R. McMaster won.
So actually, this was my next point. How would you assess the new national security team? Because I think a lot of this is down not to Trump and his immediate retinue, but it's down, as you said, to some of the generals around him.
Yeah, certainly some of the people that have been appointed around him, appointed at State Department and at DOD and on the National Security Council, they definitely have helped shape U.S. policy, I think, in the right direction. And I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that President Trump is a domestically focused president. He wants to be seen as a winner, and he wants to win the next election, and he's going to have to deliver on some of these really big promises that he made to the American people in order to get reelected. And I think as a consequence, you've seen the delegation of some of the big foreign policy and defense issues to his team. And this is a national security team that is seasoned, it's well experienced. They've been around the block a few times, and they are definitely using this this ability, the power that's been delegated to them to pursue certain policies, which often seems to be at odds with what we heard during the campaign, but overall, I think, keeps America going in the right direction.
Coming down to some specifics, particularly with regard to NATO, as we all remember, candidate Trump was very critical.
Yes.
Words such as obsolete and not fulfilling, the allies not fulfilling this whole burden sharing question, which of course every administration has brought up. But would you say, paradoxically, that Trump did focus attention on the fact that some of the allies were indeed underperforming in terms of budget, not just in the 2%, but also a percentage that should be spent on military equipment rather than social services?
Yeah,
and
exactly.
pensions?
Well, President Trump raises legitimate concerns. Perhaps the way he would raise these concerns all the time wasn't the best approach, but for sure he's put this issue squarely on the agenda for NATO. And we're seeing progress on European spending more in defense. Now, a lot of the progress we've seen were decisions taken before President Trump even announced that he was going to be president. Right. But without a doubt, there are some countries now, I believe, thinking that they should, hey, maybe he's right, we should spend more, and maybe he's serious about U.S. commitment. Now, I think that we need to be very careful with this. We do need to raise this issue of defense spending with our European partners, but NATO works because it's for everyone unconditionally. And it's known that if you attack one of these countries, then you attack all. And there's no caveats attached to that. If you read the 1949 North Atlantic Treaty, it doesn't mention anything about, well, you only get protection if you spend X amount.
Or you only get 80% protection instead of...
Yeah, exactly. You can't be half pregnant, and you can't be half in NATO. And but I think he's done a good job raising this issue and raising the profile of this issue. But a lot of people were thinking, oh, could be the end of NATO. This is the end of America's leadership in Europe. He's going to give away Crimea, stop NATO enlargement, hand Syria over to the Russians, and stop the U.S. force presence in Central and Eastern Europe. And we've seen actually the exact opposite of this. We've seen an administration that has decided to provide lethal weapons to Ukraine, something that the Obama administration didn't do. We have an administration that's now providing Javelin anti-tank missiles to Georgia, doing something. Trump did something in 8 months that President Trump didn't do in 8 years.
Obama didn't do in 8 years.
President Obama didn't do in 8 years. And we've had an increase in our Baltic air policing mission in the Baltic region. We've had a continued commitment to the forward enhanced presence in Poland. And imagine, 18 months ago, 24 months ago, someone saying this, that President Trump will enlarge NATO, right? This would be unheard of because most people wouldn't think that President Trump was going to get elected, much less if he did so enlarge NATO. Right. And on the same day that Rex Tillerson went to Moscow, President Trump signed the accession protocol for Montenegro to join. So, the policy is sound. We're definitely in a good place in terms of transatlantic security and policy towards Europe and Russia. But without a doubt, there were forces around him in the very beginning who were against this. But luckily and thankfully, they've largely departed the administration.
They still presumably talk to him, but they don't have the influence and power that those in the cabinet do. So
yes, for sure. But I would say President Trump tends to make up his own mind anyway. I mean, I know the focus is geared towards foreign policy, but with trade, which touches on both foreign policy and domestic, he's continued with his protectionist rhetoric, and even against some of the advice of his top advisors, or on the issue of Jerusalem and the capital being moved to. Capital of Israel being recognized as Jerusalem and moving the U.S. Embassy, most of his cabinet, including top national security officials, were against the timing of this move, but yet he still did it. So if he's
members of his family weren't against it.
Yes, that's true. Yes.
which may have some influence as well. Let's go back to this. What I think is a very important document, America's New National Security Strategy. How do you see it? How does it sort of direct U.S. policy for the next few years?
Well, I think it's President Trump's stamp on foreign policy. There are some departures from the Obama administration. It was interesting that it had this whole section about trade, and the way that section was framed definitely differed from previous administrations. But there were also many things that were like similar, but just packaged in a different way. Most of the time, national security strategies are public diplomacy documents, mainly addressed towards Congress or the think tank community in town. Not so much like really shaping U.S. policy in a particular region. But with this one, people are saying this could be different. And I think it remains to be seen, because I do believe that General McMaster, General Mattis, and Rex Tillerson, for the most part, are the ones really driving the U.S. foreign policy train. And while President Trump did sign off on this, and he embraced this national security strategy quite enthusiastically, I'm not so sure how much it will really alter what America is already doing right now.
Well, one of the main points I was going to come to Russia, Russia's position, not so much in terms of what they did in interfering in our democratic elections, but in terms of its Russia's revisionist policy in the region. But the security document, security strategy does underscore that Russia is a rival and a competitor, which sort of contradicts what Trump has been saying, or what he's been mute on saying, let's put it that way, vis-a-vis Moscow. Is there a disconnect there between the document and some of Trump's statements?
Well, this goes back to the disconnect between a lot of his campaign rhetoric and what he's now doing sitting in the Oval Office. I think having that huge responsibility sitting in the Oval Office as the commander-in-chief sort of changes one's mind on certain issues. When you now have access to intelligence, when you now have the responsibility for the well-being of the nation. And I think the national security strategy, by identifying the big nation-state threats like Russia and China and Iran and North Korea over some of the transnational terrorism threats that we have really been focused on since 9/11. I think this was actually a fundamental shift. And I think this was
like a new era.
And I think this is a reasonable and realistic approach to U.S. foreign policy. We often forget what it's like to have this state-on-state rivalry. We had it during the Cold War. Since the Cold War, not so much, but the world is turning, I would say, from what it was, this bipolar world during the Cold War, to this multipolar world that's more keen to what diplomats would have experienced in the 19th century, for example. In fact, I often say if you took a diplomat from 1880 and one from 1980 and had both of them cryogenically frozen, and you woke both of them up today, it would be the one from 1880 who would most recognize the world we're living in.
Yeah, that's right. It's also important point you make is that it's a post 9/11 world in many respects. I mean, over the past, since 2001, there has been this focus on countering international terrorism as the main threat to security. Now suddenly this document talks about great power rivalry.
And we do need to continue with our focus on counterterrorism without a doubt, but we can't ignore the big powers, these revisionist powers like Russia. This is where the stakes are the highest. ISIS does not have the ability to end our way of life. They don't pose an existential threat to the United States or to our allies. The black flag of the caliphate will never be flying over the Capitol's dome. But Russia, whether or not if they have the intent, which they don't, thankfully, they certainly have the ability to end our way of life. They could do so. And we have to take powers like this very seriously, especially when you look at what Russia's doing in its region around the borders of its countries. With the invasion of Georgia, the invasion of Ukraine, the meddling in the Baltics, and also as we've seen in Western Europe with elections. This is a serious issue that does undermine U.S. interests, not only at home, but also in the region. I think a big problem we have in Washington is that people are still in this cold mine mindset. You hear people, you hear commentators say, describe Russia's behavior today as Cold War behavior. You often hear, well, what Putin is doing is what is like what the Soviets did. And actually, I think this is wrong. I think this is actually imperial behavior. This is how Russia behaved during the time of the Tsar, before the revolution. We have a 21st century Russia with 19th century ambitions, and I think that's very dangerous right now when you have someone like Vladimir Putin at the top.
I always try and educate my students whenever I talk to them, or diplomats, that it wasn't so much the fall of communism, although that was extremely important, but it was the liberation of all the countries that were subsumed under the Soviet bloc and the Soviet Union.
Exactly.
And that's what we need to maintain. As you say, there's an imperialist streak definitely in the Kremlin. The security strategy does actually say, well, it depicts Russia and China, as you said, as both a rival and a competitor, which then begs the question, is this a country we can cooperate with? I know Trump and Obama in particular pushed this reset button, that there's things that we can work with. Trump, unfortunately, has also talked about cooperating in counterterrorism with Russia.
Yeah.
And we know Russia's true position on terrorism, apart from it being a state terrorist actor. It does have connections, and it would like to see some of the jihadist terrorists turn their attention to the West rather than to us.
Well, luckily, I think President Trump and his administration is learning very quickly that as long as Vladimir Putin is in power, Russia cannot be our partner. And this is unfortunate because there actually are areas that we should be able to cooperate with Russia on, and we simply can't, because nothing since coming to power in 1999 has proven Vladimir Putin to be a trustworthy partner to the United States. President Bush, it took him 2 terms to learn this. Remember in his first term early on, he had that press conference with Putin, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said he looked into his eyes and he could see a good soul.
He was hypnotized.
Yeah, well, I could tell you, as a former KGB officer, Putin looked into Bush's eyes and saw a case number. And then you had Obama in the first term with the Russian reset. Hillary Clinton symbolically, if not awkwardly, pressing that reset button with Sergei Lavrov. And then in his next term, we had Ukraine and the invasion of Crimea.
Right.
I think President Trump learned early on from the experiences in Syria and Russia's cover-up of Bashar al-Assad's use of chemical weapons that resulted in that airstrike, the U.S.-led cruise missile strike, and as a way to retaliate against Assad's use of chemical weapons. And I think that the way Russia was trying to cover up for Damascus, probably convinced President Trump that, well, maybe he isn't trustworthy. I would like to work with him, but maybe I just can't. And thankfully, this happened early on in the administration. And I think with, as I already alluded to, the weapons to Ukraine and Georgia and the commitment to forward enhanced presence and to enlarging NATO with Montenegro, I think President Trump and his administration understands the true challenge that we face with Russia.
And another question in cooperating with Russia, I remember at one point the president came back from meeting with Putin and announced there would be cooperation in cyber security, which was immediately almost, I would say, laughed off the stage by our intelligence community.
Literally, I would say.
But presumably there's no such plans
No,
afoot.
not to my knowledge. This was immediately rejected, not only by the policy community, intelligence community, and it was eventually walked back by President Trump himself. For the first few months, I was willing to mark some of these down as schoolboy errors, rookie mistakes. And we've seen a lot less of this rhetoric since then. But the situation in Syria continues to be a very important source of friction between the U.S. and Russia. The ongoing occupation of Crimea and what's happening in Luhansk and Donetsk continues to be what Russia's doing in the Balkans. There's a lot of areas around the world where Russia's really testing U.S. resolve and undermining U.S. interests. And hopefully we're going to, see policies fall into place that counter this.
Well, 2 other areas. I mean, Russia helps Iran. It's its closest partner in the Middle East. And, of course, Iranian policy runs counter to what we're trying to achieve in the region. And secondly, North Korea. There is evidence now evidently coming out that Russia is actually not only breaking sanctions, but it's been helping North Korea to develop its nuclear weapons program. do you see this as a huge challenge between Russia and US because of the Korean question?
Well, I think Russia uses these opportunities to help bring more pressure onto the US and to make things just that much more difficult for the United States. And with Iran, I honestly have no idea what Moscow thinks in the long term they're going to get out of this. Russia and Persia for centuries have been regional competitors and enemies for most of history. And all of a sudden, Russia's willing to basically do Iran's dirty work on the international stage, provide cover for them over its nuclear weapons program, always find excuses on why Iran is up to doing this or why Iran is doing that. And I just don't see what Russia stands to benefit with this. With North Korea, again, this is another area where Russia can indirectly apply a lot of pressure to U.S. allies and U.S. interests in the region to try to undermine the United States and the effectiveness of the United States. I mean, I think this is the main reason why Russia is in Syria. If not the main reason, I would say the top of the reasons why. I mean, firstly, I think Russia wants to keep someone like Bashar al-Assad in power because they want to maintain their naval base and their strategic foothold in the Eastern Med. But secondly, I think Russia sees Syria as a way to show that the U.S. is weak or undermine the United States.
To keep us out, basically.
Yeah, to keep the U.S. devoting more and more resources to Syria so we have less resources to devote to other places like the Baltics or Central and Eastern Europe, for example. So Russia's actually very clever when it comes to this sort of grand strategy on how they confront us. And I think that's where the U.S. is really lacking, where Russians will see what's happening in Ukraine and Syria and Georgia and North Korea as being interconnected.
Part of a chess game.
We don't see that. When Russia goes to the Ukraine poker table, he brings his chips from the Syria poker table, and we don't do that.
Where does Turkey fit into this picture? Because as you said, traditionally, the Ottomans and the Tsarist Russians have been competing, fighting. There were several wars between the two. Now Russia has, let's say, put in certain hooks into Turkey, has trying to pull Turkey away from NATO.
This is a great example, and I found, I looked into this issue, and I found 12 examples of major wars between Turkey and Russia, or the Ottomans and Russia, since the 1500s.
Exactly.
And a lot of smaller skirmishes in between. I'm actually one that's quite relaxed about Turkey's perceived rapprochement with Russia because, as you pointed out, it goes against the course of centuries of history. And Russia and the Ottomans, or Russia and Turkey, just like Russia and Persia, have always been regional competitors. You'd have to defy, like I said, centuries of history to change this, and I just don't see that happening. I think President Putin uses this as a way to draw a wedge, or create a wedge between NATO and its Western partners between Turkey and its Western partners in NATO. And I think that Erdogan uses this as a way to try to get more out of NATO. And you saw with the debate about S-400 missiles being purchased. It still hasn't been finalized. Honestly, I'm not so certain it will ever be finalized, but it's a very convenient tool that Erdogan is using to try to get better deals from other countries on missile defense technology. But with U.S. specifically, Turkey is a problem right now. But we've had 70 or so years of good cooperation with Turkey, security cooperation inside NATO. And I'm not quite ready to throw away 7 decades of that good relationship for 7 challenging years with President Erdogan. And I hope the relationship with Ankara is so important. I hope we can find ways to work it out in the future.
Well, one of the big potential flashpoints, of course, which could draw in Turkey and NATO as well as Russia, is the South Caucasus. And you actually have just produced, I wish I had a copy with me, but it's available on the Heritage website, very important report entitled NATO Membership for Georgia in US and European Interests. Can you summarize why further enlargement, particularly in the South Caucasus, bringing in Georgia into NATO is so important for international security?
Well, I give 3 reasons in the paper on why it's in America's interest to bring Georgia into NATO when it's ready. And the first one is it's time we start rewarding our good allies and friends. Georgia has proven itself to be a dependable and reliable partner, whether it's in Iraq or Afghanistan over the years. And for example, many don't realize that at the time of the Russian invasion in 2008, Georgia had the second most number of troops in Iraq after the United States. They have the largest non-NATO contribution in Afghanistan today, and at the height of the war, they had the largest per capita contribution, over 2,000 Georgian soldiers.
And casualties, I think.
And casualties, they also had the largest per capita of any coalition member, but yet they only joined the campaign halfway through, like around 2009. So Georgia has shown itself to be a dependable and reliable U.S. partner, and I think we should start rewarding this behavior. The second is sort of the normative aspect of it all. Georgia has done a lot since it regained its independence from the Soviet Union in the early 90s in terms of improving its governance, its economic freedom, its judicial system, its security services, and its military. And we should be rewarding this. It's a beacon of democracy in what is a very difficult and challenging region of the world. It's not perfect, but in my opinion, democracy is a process and not an event. And we're still learning a lot of things here in the United States about this as well. But they've made huge strides, and we should be rewarding this as well. And finally, it's more of a selfish U.S.-focused reason, but we need allies in places of the world where Georgia is located. Along the South Caucasus, the key transit routes from east to west, bringing energy, trade from the heart of Eurasia into Europe. Every barrel of oil that comes from the Caspian region through Georgia and Azerbaijan and Turkey is one less that has to come to Europe from Russia. Russia knows this, and that's why they don't like it. And that's why it's in our interest to have influence and have a toehold in this region with dependable allies, because there are broader geopolitical reasons, interests for the United States in the South Caucasus. For example, I was, a couple of weeks ago when I was in Georgia, I was also in Azerbaijan, and I went to visit the new port, the new Baku port. It's about an hour south of Baku. Massive port under construction. To sort of be the hub of north, south, east, and west in the region. All the rail links meet there. I stood at the very beginning of the Baku-Tbilisi-Kars rail line. And the port is already partially in operation, and there was a ship getting ready to cross the Caspian, and I asked my host what's on the ship, and come to find out it was chickens heading to U.S. forces in Afghanistan. So the U.S. is already using this land bridge to resupply and supply U.S. troops in Afghanistan. And I think as we find Pakistan to be a more dubious partner, and also our inability to work with Russia over Afghanistan, we're going to need these sort of transit links for our forces in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, there's several let's say Trans-Caspian link is very important, linking Azerbaijan with Central Asia, and as you said, including Afghanistan, but also from Azerbaijan to Europe. You know, this TANAP and pipeline, Trans-Anatolian pipeline, the Trans-Balkan pipeline, the new gas stream, which I think is coming online later this year.
Yes, that's right.
Small volumes to begin with, but I think that's key because that helps to undercut Russia's monopolization of gas supplies to Europe.
It helps undercut Russia's control over European gas supply. If the legal dispute over the Caspian can never be resolved, it could allow for a Trans-Caspian natural gas pipeline linking Turkmenistan into the southern gas corridor, which offers huge potential for a country like Turkmenistan to diversify its export market, so it's not reliant on China or Russia. So there is a lot of potential here, and this is a part of the world that most policymakers don't want to focus on for whatever reason. You know, it's a complex region of the world. You hear names like Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Nagorno-Karabakh, and people, you know, don't really want to deal with that mess. But we need to deal with that. We need to be involved there. We need to have a presence because there are national security interests at stake.
And it's so many cross-cutting regions. You talked about Iran before. Well, another reason Russia wants to maintain the alliance with Iran is it creates this north-south block, if you like, against the emerging east-west connectivity.
Exactly. And that's the importance of countries like Azerbaijan. I mean, if you look at a map, in terms of east-west transit, from the Arctic Ocean to the Indian Ocean, there are three countries: Russia, Azerbaijan, and Iran. And
Exactly.
that bottleneck is right there, right in
Exactly.
the middle. And that's why we need to have good relations with countries like Azerbaijan.
Let's delve back into the Balkans a little bit, particularly for our viewers. Montenegro, NATO member, after a long, arduous path, but I think they fully deserved it. What are the next steps, would you say, for NATO in the West Balkans? Are there other countries that are on track for membership?
Well, the recent developments over the name dispute in Macedonia, between Macedonia and Greece, it's looking like there could be some sort of resolution to this. It'll be, of course, up to the Macedonian people to determine if whatever their government agrees with Greece is acceptable or not. I don't want to weigh into that debate, but I think it would be great if all sides could come to an agreement and get Macedonia inside NATO. I mean, they hold this dubious record of completing the most annual national programs. I say that you should open up a center of excellence on annual national programs.
How to qualify for NATO membership without actually getting
I mean, this whole thing is absurd. You know, frankly speaking, the Greeks have behaved very irresponsibly in terms of the overall health of the transatlantic alliance with this. This is a country that Macedonia was ready to join in 2008, had completed MAP, and over a name dispute and the naming of an airport and a couple of statues, all their progress to Euro-Atlantic integration has been put on hold. So it is in America's interest that this is resolved and we can enlarge NATO to include Macedonia. I think every piece of the puzzle we can make stable and secure in the Western Balkans is in America's interest, and I think part of that puzzle is alliances like NATO, for example.
And who's next after presumably Macedonia? If the name question is resolved, would get very, very fast track, let's say, towards membership. What about Bosnia and Herzegovina?
Well, other than Macedonia, the only two official aspirant countries are Georgia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. And honestly, the way things are going in Bosnia with the developments in Republika Srpska and the very cozy ties we're seeing with Russia, usually vis-a-vis Serbia, I'm not optimistic. I don't think the U.S., for example, has shown the continued commitment to the region that it should be. I also think the same is true with the European Union. The Western Balkans is a place, I think, of press releases. Officials go there, press releases are sent out, but we're reducing our presence on the ground, and I don't think we're as committed as we should be, and Russia's filling that vacuum. So I would love to see someday where countries like Bosnia and Herzegovina can be part of NATO, but I think as long as there's this separatist tendency bubbling below the surface in Republika Srpska, usually egged on by Moscow and Serbia, I'm not too optimistic. Well,
the most pro-American and pro-NATO country in the region is, of course, Kosovo. Yes. How do you see Kosovo's progress towards NATO membership?
I think very slow, but heading in the right direction, and I think that's important. Each country in the region is going to approach these differently, and the biggest problem Kosovo is going to have is with Europe, in my opinion. I mean, there are some countries in the European Union and in NATO that don't even recognize its independence, and this is a big problem if you want to join the alliance. But I think the reason why I say slow is because I think over time people are going to accept this, and it'll be a very slow process, but eventually it'll happen. It could be a generational change, but it's important for the U.S. to stay engaged in Kosovo and in the region to reassure these countries that we are there to support them and we want to help them along this journey to transatlantic integration.
Well, we still have Camp Bondsteel with several hundred U.S. troops present in Kosovo. Do you think we should be more actively helping to structure a Kosovo army? Not a large army, but an army that can find its niche, that can find its place, let's say, in the region?
Well, I think this is inevitable. When people suggest that Kosovo as an independent sovereign state can continue on without having an army because of the political circumstances, the historical issues, I think this is completely unrealistic. Sovereignty equals stability, and this means respecting other sovereignty, and this means being able to enforce and defend your own sovereignty. And part of that is having an army. So I think it's inevitable that in the long term, Kosovo will have an army, and perhaps some regional countries might not like that, but that's just going to be the reality. You can't expect a country to go on forever without, I mean, perhaps I guess Iceland is a good example of a NATO country that doesn't have an army, but their geopolitical situation is a little different.
Yeah, an island far away.
Yeah.
What would you say about Serbia? In the case of its links with Russia, there is a Russian, let's say, it's called a humanitarian base in Niš, but we all understand it to be a listening post, and maybe one that trains special forces in the region. Where does Serbia stand in this, let's say, Balkan puzzle?
Well, it's also my understanding they want to open up a similar base in Republika Srpska too, which will further complicate Bosnia and Herzegovina's progress towards the Euro-Atlantic community. But I think with Serbia, U.S. policymakers need to go into this relationship with their eyes open, and we need to be pragmatic. Serbia is always going to have that alignment with Russia, but we need to try to keep the door open for them if they want to have better and closer relations with the West. And we shouldn't close that door on them, but we should realize what we're dealing with. And often we're dealing with a country that is a facilitator of Russian malign influence in the Western Balkans.
There's been some talk recently in Washington about not just expanding the base in Bonstil, but maybe building a base in Brčko, between, as you said, Republika Srpska and the Federation, as a sign that, we haven't fully withdrawn, that we're looking very closely, monitoring what Russia's up to, and we will not allow this country to be destabilized again. Do you think that's a good idea, some sort of base in Bosnia?
Well, firstly, any such base, I think, needs to be at the invitation of the government. And we need to work with the government to find mutually acceptable ways to enhance U.S. presence in the region. Perhaps a base is one way that could be done, or maybe more routine troop rotations through. Maybe could be a way to work up to a permanent base.
Like in the Baltics, the enhanced presence.
Exactly. I am concerned about what has been like the whittling down of the force presence in the Balkans, whether it's in Bonstil with the U.S. and America's contribution there, or with the U4-led mission in Bosnia. I remember just at the time of Kosovo's independence, there were around 2,000 European troops in Bosnia. They had a over-the-horizon battalion on immediate standby somewhere in Europe that could come in. And now I think we're down to just a few hundred troops.
Yeah.
And tell me what has changed in the security situation between now and then? Not much. If anything,
it's got worse.
It's got worse and it's more complex. And I feel that many Europeans and also us in the United States feel like, oh, well, this is, we've done our work here, we're finished, and that's far from being true.
I'm often asked in the region whether, whenever a new administration comes in, I know we're already a year into the Trump administration, but do you expect any new policy vis-a-vis the Balkans to what we saw before?
Well, I've spoken to officials in the administration about this, and everyone seems to acknowledge that the U.S. needs to play a bigger role in the Balkans. Now, whether or not this translates into a new policy, I'm not so sure. There are a lot of issues out there that's taking a lot of time, a lot of energy and focus on the administration, whether it's North Korea, Iran, or Russia, transnational terrorism. But you have a lot of these issues that cross over into the Balkans. You have Russian influence big time in the Balkans. You have the threat of radicalization in certain communities in the Balkans. You have the refugee issue, using the Balkans to transit. You even have cases of Iranian influence in the region. And I hope that we can see an administration that can walk and chew gum at the same time when it comes to how we deal with complex challenges in the world, and we can focus on the Balkans. But I'm not quite sure the administration is there yet.
Yeah. Let me ask you, actually, we're coming near to the end of our time here, but I want to look a little bit at the US-EU relationship, and particularly through the prism of this new initiative, PESCO, a permanent structured cooperation on security and defense. I know you're smiling about it, but is this something that's going to compete with NATO, complement NATO, or simply fizzle out as many EU initiatives do?
Fizzle out, I would say. Honestly, I think in a few years from now, we'll laugh at PESCO in the same way we laugh at the Helsinki headline goal, or the headline goal 2010, which was the EU battle group concept.
Or even the West European Union, I
Western European Union, which is, no expert can actually tell you what its status is right now. Some say it's defunct, others say, well, it still exists on paper, no one really knows. But look, NATO's the only show in town when it comes to European security. And the cornerstone of Europe's security has been NATO and the US military presence for decades. And I go back to Madeleine Albright's 3Ds. She wrote an op-ed in the Financial Times in December, I think, of 1999, when the idea of, it was then called European Security and Defense Initiative, before it became ESDP and now CSDP.
You can get lost in this jumble,
But she wrote there are 3Ds the U.S. should be concerned with. No discrimination, no duplication, and no decoupling. So the EU should not be discriminating in its defense and military policies against European countries that are not in the EU but are in NATO. So in this case today, Turkey, Norway, Iceland, Croatia, or not Croatia, but Iceland and Albania. No decoupling of the United States from European security, so the U.S. still needs to play a major role in Europe's security, and then no duplication of what NATO's already doing. Especially in this era of scarce resources, every euro spent on an EU defense initiative is one less that can be spent on NATO. And when people say, don't worry, EU defense capabilities can also be used for NATO, I warn them because this cannot be taken for granted. There are countries that are in the European Union that are consider themselves to be neutral, that are not in NATO. And all it takes is one veto from one of these countries to block any sort of progress or cooperation. And we've actually seen this on the ground with Operation Concordia, which was when the EU took over the mission in Macedonia, and a dispute between Cyprus and Turkey slowed down the transition of this mission from a NATO mission to an EU mission.
Right. And in fact, paradoxically, one of the things that our national security team wants to guard against is for the EU defense industry, which is pretty much fractured, but it becomes protectionist. That excludes us from bidding process for equipment that European NATO forces could buy.
Yeah, this is a very controversial issue. And I remember a number of years ago the European Parliament passing non-binding resolutions on buy European equipment for defense. And you know, I believe that your defense procurement programs, whether they're in the United States or in Europe, need to provide the best capability for the armed forces at the best cost to the taxpayer. And unless you can prove it's a sovereign capability that has to be held at home because your country's survival depends on it, I don't believe in this sort of protectionist racket when it comes to defense equipment. I think Europe benefits greatly from buying U.S. equipment. I think sometimes the U.S. benefits also from buying European equipment.
Right. Luke Coffey, Heritage Foundation. On that note, we'll end today's show. Love to have you back at some point in the future as things develop.
Thank you. It'd be my pleasure.
There's always plenty to talk about. Thank you, and best of luck in your work.
Thank you so
very
much. Thank you.
Unfortunately, we have already come to the end of today's show. I have greatly enjoyed being with you and with my colleagues at RTK and VOA. Good night, everyone. Stay healthy. Be productive and remain optimistic. See you all very soon. Mira Pavshim.